So, I've been on this plant-based diet for 6 years. And whenever in spite of the, benefits that I've achieved, every time somebody meets me, they never fail to ask me, where do you get your protein from? Right? Luckily, there are certain other plant-based animals who, are not bothered by this question. So what is this peculiar protein problem that we humans seem to be suffering from? Right? So let's look into this. Few disclaimers: this information provided is not a replacement for any medical advice. References, whatever I'm talking, will be listed. You can cross-check them. Medical knowledge is always evolving. I'm only presenting and interpreting the data that is available. I do not, of course, claim to have read each and every article out there. I'm always open to learn more. So, having said this, let's go. A quick into the basics. Proteins, as we all know, are chains of amino acids. The important part, what differentiates them from carbs and fats, is the fact that they have nitrogen in them. Okay, which is why plants are the true producers of proteins, because they are the only ones that can assimilate nitrogen from the soil to make amino acids. All animals, including humans, are only middlemen. Like proteins, of course, we all associate them with our muscles, contractile proteins, but they are extremely important for multiple other uses in the body, right? Now, when we take food, the dietary protein gets broken down into amino acids. Some of them are lost into the feces, but the majority get absorbed into what is known as the free amino acid pool. Now, this pool is a very small fraction, just less than 1% of the total protein that our body has, which basically means that excess proteins are not stored in the body. They're either excreted as urea by the kidneys or they're stored as fat by the liver. So this has to be understood. These usually questions I ask on a live audience here. If anybody wants, they can type in the chat box. If anybody watching it on YouTube can pause the video and try and think of this answer. So which is the recommended diet for endurance runners the night before a run? Is it a high fat diet, high carb, high protein, or a balanced diet? Well, the answer is it is a high carb diet. Why? Because body energy systems rely on carbs and fats. Okay, proteins contribute very little towards the energy. In fact, less than 5% of the energy comes from proteins on a routine basis. Okay, many of these amino acids are used for synthesis of metabolites, but what is extremely important is there's a huge protein recycling going on. As much as 250 grams per day, that is multiple times the protein that we intake, is constantly daily being broken down into amino acids and reformed. Okay, and this is a very effective mechanism in our body for balancing the protein requirements. Now, this was a randomized controlled trial which was done. A group was given 2.4 grams of protein per kg per day, and other group was given just zero point 0.4 for a period of 12 weeks. They observed that the low protein intake did not result in a more negative whole protein balance, nor did it lower the basal protein synthesis rates. This is the beauty of adaptation of our body, right? So there is a certain balance in our body, and the body, in fact, has all the protein and amino acid it needs to maintain our muscle mass. The question is then, why do we need to eat proteins at all, right? Well, that's because there are certain unavoidable losses that are happening in our body. The proteins are lost in the form of skin, hair, nail, sweat, and also in the urine after they get oxidized, right? So we need to eat the daily dietary protein to replace these unavoidable losses. So the first question that we're going to address today is how much protein do we need for this purpose? Again, a question. So who will need more dietary protein? A healthy sedentary male, a healthy sedentary female, a healthy active male, a healthy active female, or will all need the same? Well, the answer is all will need the same. Why? Because proteins are a little different from carbs and fats. Now, carbs and fats are basically energy providers. So their requirement for our body depends on our caloric needs. And as we all know, these caloric needs depend on our age, our gender, and activity. But protein needs depend mainly on the body's unavoidable losses, which are decided by the body weight of a person, which is why protein requirements are always mentioned in per kg, right? They're not affected by age, not affected by gender, not affected by our physical activity even. This was a beautiful paper by WHO, which says there is little evidence to suggest that the magnitude of the obligatory nitrogen losses, which is the unavoidable losses, varies much between comparable age groups for different parts of the world, which means they're not even affected by the race or the nationality, right? And all this, the amount of unavoidable losses have been calculated by this meta-analysis which was done, and it was concluded that the average requirement is 0.66 grams per kg per day, which means 50% of the population requires even less than this. But to be safe, the RDA recommended daily allowance is kept at 0.83, which is 2 standard deviations above the mean, which will cover nearly 100% of the population, right? Of course, a lot of questions have been raised post that study, whether this is the ideal requirement and whether we need to more. Some people have done reanalysis, but there are some red flags in these studies. Like for this study, they added 9 more studies. So it's not exactly the same data they are analyzing. And these new studies had higher protein intakes, which is not ideal. Plus, they use the limiting amino acid concept, which in a way is flawed. And I'm going to talk about it more a little later, right? So in spite of all the questions raised, the RDA by all guidelines is still the same. 0.66 is the average and the RDA is 0.83 regardless of physical activity or gender. Now, a healthy person puts on 15 kgs of weight. Okay. So his protein requirement will now increase, decrease, or remain the same. Well, the answer is it will remain the same even though the weight has increased. Why? Because it is decided by the ideal body weight of a person, not by the actual weight. We do not have to provide proteins for excess fat that we are carrying around. Okay. So there is a height, and based on the height, there is a certain ideal weight that a person should be having, and your protein requirements depend upon that. So if you are 150 kgs, it doesn't mean that you have to take that much of proteins. You just have to calculate what is your ideal weight and take accordingly. So for example, average height 5'8", 65 kg weight, the requirement, even if you consider on the higher side 1 gram per protein per day, it will be 65 grams. So we require around 0.8 to 1 gram per kg of ideal weight per day. Okay, this is important. The next question, can we get enough protein from plants? Well, Justus von Liebig, way back, he was a great founder of organic chemistry, hypothesized, okay, he just made a hypothesis that muscular energy comes from animal protein and that vegetarians were incapable of prolonged exercise. This was his hypothesis. But the USDA in 1890, as back as that, based their protein recommendations on his idea. Okay, and later it was shown that muscular energy comes from carbs, but the idea got fixed that muscles means you have to eat meat. And of course, the industry has never let that thought go. They keep repeating it with various kinds of advertisement. But could there be any truth to it? Do plants really have enough proteins? Well, let's break it down and understand. Let's take an example. An average Indian male, 35-year-old, sedentary, 5 feet 8 inch height, ideal weight is 65 kg, right? So the daily protein requirement, if you remember, would be either 52 grams, that is the RDA, or even if you consider 1 gram for argument's sake, let's say 65 grams, okay, is what they require. Now, if you see the caloric requirement for that person based on the standard chart would be roughly 2,300 calories, right? Okay. Now, 1 gram of protein we know gives 4 calories. Okay. So the caloric intake, suppose that person takes 65 grams of proteins, he will have to take 260 calories from proteins. Okay. Is that clear so far? So 260 out of 2300, that's 11.3% of your calories should come from protein. Let's take 12%. So if 12% of your calories come from proteins, then it is known as a protein energy ratio. Now, this is a very important part, PER of 12%. Whatever energy you are consuming, how much of it is coming from proteins is the PER. So what does this mean? It means that any diet, okay, of 2,300 calories, which has foods with PER of more than 12%, will provide you adequate dietary requirement of proteins. So going the other way, 12% of 2300 is 270 calories coming from proteins. That means you're automatically consuming 69 grams of proteins, which is much more than what is recommended. So based on PER, a food is called a source of protein if the PER is more than 12%. It is called a high protein source if the PER is more than 20%. So rather than telling you this product has more protein, that product has more protein, let us see the PER of different food products. If you look at legumes, they are all high protein sources. Look at the PER, right? If you look at vegetables, again, they have high PER, whether spinach, broccoli, cauliflower, mushrooms, peas, cucumbers, cabbage, whatever you take, they are all high PER products. Grains are just sources of proteins. They are not high sources of proteins. Okay. Nuts and seeds, again, sources of proteins, not high because a lot of the calories come from fats in them. Fruits, on the other hand, are not considered as sources of proteins. They have multiple other benefits, but not for proteins. In fact, if all calories came from broccoli alone, of course, this is theoretical, you can't have so much of broccoli, still, one would get more protein than if they came from beef alone. In fact, spinach has a greater PER than chicken and fish. What does this mean? Vegans, that is plant-based diet eating people who eat varied diets, will have no difficulty in obtaining enough protein from regular diet. So to get adequate proteins, eat adequate calories, eat more foods with high PER. So yes, we can get enough proteins from plants if we follow the right protocol. So the question is then, are we protein deficient? Now, this is the big thing. If you type on Google, are Indians protein deficient? You will get multiple articles showing that, there's a huge problem going on in India. And in fact, even in the world, people say. And that is why the protein supplements market is just going on, increasing and projected to rise further. In fact, there's a certain protein fever going on everywhere. Your protein has been added to each and every product. There's milk with extra milk. So they're adding milk powder to milk also and selling. I mean, who knows what's expected next? Protein samosas, protein vada pav, protein cigarettes. You don't know where this is going, right? But where's the data for this if you have to look into it, right? When I tried to search, each article is giving the reference of other articles and it's just like a bhul bhulaiya out there. But somehow, somewhere I was managed to get hold of this survey, which many people seem to be, quoting. And this survey interviewed a total of 1,260 people for a population of 150 crore. And they concluded that 91% of vegetarians and 85% of non-vegetarians were protein deficient. Again, finding this article full text was very difficult. I managed to do it. This is not the abstract. This is the full text. Okay, fitting in one slide of my PowerPoint. There is no details of dietary intakes or protein sources. Nothing is mentioned how they have calculated and come to this figure. was written by a senior manager at Nutricia International Private Limited, which sells Protein X. Okay. So is there no protein deficiency? Well, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So let's look at more reliable studies which don't make such sensational news. If you look at this article by NIN, published in British Journal of Nutrition, and this has listed studies right from 1975 in Indian population, rural and urban. They have given the weight and the mean protein intake per day. And if you see, it is all in the range of 1 to 1.3 grams per kg per day. Okay, and this is in spite of the fact that majority of the proteins are in fact coming from cereals and millets, that is grains, which are having less PER, we have seen, and not as much from legumes, which have in fact more PER. This was another comparison with the Eat Lancet reference diet, which showed that share of calories coming from proteins for Indians is only 6 to 8% in India compared to 29% in the reference diet. That says like we are just reaching like 25% of the target. So this is also a scary statistic, and this is a very respected article and well published journal. The problem here is that the Eat Lancet reference diet, what does it do? It separates protein sources, that is basically animal sources and legumes and nuts separately. And whole grains, vegetables, and even dairy is not considered as a protein source. So if you look at protein sources alone, then yes, Indians consume less of meat, eggs, nuts, and legumes, which is why only 25% is what they're quoting. But Indians eat excess of grains and starchy vegetables and dairy also. So they go on to say, but that is not very prominently understood, that India do not consume adequate amounts of fruits, vegetables, and non-cereal proteins in their diet. Meaning, we are getting proteins from cereals in our product, which doesn't mean that if you're not consuming protein sources, doesn't mean that we are not getting proteins. It's just that we are not getting them from the higher sources. Let's look at more studies. What India eats, a comprehensive detail. I'm focusing only on the protein part. If you look at the calories consumed and the proteins consumed, we are at a PER of around 11.4%, right? And that is again in spite of 65% coming from cereals, 7% only from legumes, and 9% from animal sources. And the guidelines clearly say that households with energy inadequacy was 70%, while protein inadequacy was 27%. So the primary bottleneck is energy inadequacy and not the protein. If you consume more calories, you will get more proteins as well. Its consumption of pulses and legumes, which are important sources of protein, was less than 50% of the RD. This is just come out fresh from the oven, so to speak, June 2025. It was released, in fact, on 2nd, just 4 5 days earlier. Luckily, I was able to go through the data. Huge amounts of households across all states and union territories, huge document. If you see, the current average per capita intake is 62 grams per day for Indians. But what is more important than per capita is the per consumer unit, where children are considered as children. In per capita, even children requirements are measured as adults, is 68 grams per day. Okay. Again, what has happened now is the number of contribution from cereals has started coming down. Okay. Unfortunately, pulses are still where it was pretty much. What has increased is the consumption of animal foods. Okay. Unfortunately, that is not a good sign, and why I'm going to come and explain to you a little later. If you look at the world data, Indians consume the least amount of protein, but still, as per the average daily protein requirement, we are just reaching there. Okay. But what we are not able to reach is the calories that we are required. So increasing our calorie intake will also increase our protein intake. So protein deficiency rarely occurs as an isolated condition. It is commonly due to insufficient food intake, inadequate calories leading to inadequate proteins. But then can a protein plant diet be protein deficient? Of course it can. If you eat excessive junk food, which is what we are doing, a lot of our food that we are eating is highly refined and processed. Or if we eat only fruits, or if we eat only cereals, like we say, cereal predominant diet that we are having is the problem. Or during starvation, right? Less calories, less protein. Or if we consider higher protein requirements, meaning if you say that instead of 0.8, the world requires 1.2 grams of protein, then entire Asia and Africa will become protein deficient. If you say that we require 1.4 gram per kg per day, then the whole world will become protein deficient suddenly. But based on the current recommended guidelines, an adequate and balanced whole foods plant-based diet will provide the necessary proteins. So are we protein deficient? Well, we have a lot of scope for improvement. We have to reduce our intake from cereals. We have to increase the intake from legumes. Okay. Next question, is taking more protein better? Okay, fine. We may not be as deficient as we are thinking, but why not take more, right? So this was meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials, PER of 30 versus 17, which did show that high protein diet provides modest benefits for reductions in body weight, fat mass, and triglycerides. Okay. Another meta-analysis of 74 RCTs this time showed that non-significant effects on most of the parameters, but they also noticed adverse gastrointestinal events which were common, and there was no dose response seen with higher protein intake. Plus, they concluded that higher protein diets probably improve adiposity, blood pressure, and triglyceride levels, but these effects are small and need to be weighed against the potential for harms. Which brings us to the other side of the story. What harms are they talking about? because overconsumption of proteins may lead to some health problem. More is not necessarily better, right? There are multiple issues with excess protein intake as well. And studies have shown that in pregnancy, if females increase their protein intake, then small for gestational age babies are more likely to happen. Babies who consume excess proteins end up having higher BMI as children, and adults who have excess proteins have an increased mortality risk of diabetes, cancer, and heart disease, especially if the protein is animal protein. Okay. If we quick look into mTOR, it is a protein kinase that controls protein synthesis. It has shown that high protein diets increase cardiovascular risk by activating mTOR. Okay, and consuming a very high protein intake. What is that very high? 22% of daily calories coming from protein, right? And they identified a leucine mediated threshold. So leucine as a key activator of mTOR. So what is this mTOR? Well, whenever mTOR activity in our body increases, it leads to cell growth proliferation, which leads to diseases and aging. When mTOR activity is reduced, it goes into autophagy repair maintenance mode, which is necessary for health and longevity. And animal foods have high amino acids, especially leucine, which increase the mTOR activity, while plant foods having limited amino acids, low leucine, help lead to health and longevity. The multiple diseases which have not been now being linked with excess mTOR. Low protein, high carb diet has been shown to play a critical role in longevity and metabolic health. That was the theory which I told you. This is the evidence. Intake of animal protein, particularly red meat, which contains high levels of methionine and branched chain amino acids, may be related to promotion of age-related diseases. So I would say the jury is out how much protein you exactly need. Minimum you have to take 0.8 to 1 gram per kg per day. That equals to around 12% of PER. The safe maximum from whatever studies I've seen is around 1.6 grams per kg per day. That equals to around 20% of PER. Right? So moderation is the key as far as protein is taking is concerned. Don't go overboard. The next big thing are plant proteins incomplete, right? So proteins that contain all the 9 essential amino acids are known as complete protein. And there is a concept that animal proteins are complete and plant proteins are incomplete. So let us understand that by doing a quick fact check. Now, these I'm showing you different sources and the amino acids present in different sources: meat, dairy, veggies, beans, grains, seeds, and nuts, right? So if you see, first of all plant proteins have all essential amino acids, right? That is very clear. This is the 100% line, which means that is the daily intake that we need to take. Okay. Now, based on this, you can see that 7 amino acids are fully adequate. There's no problem. 2 amino acids are found borderline in plant sources. Specifically, veggies and beans have low methionine, and grains, nuts, and seeds have low lysine. Okay. Now, this is where the limiting amino acid concept comes into play. And to explain this, we have this example of Liebig barrel. So if you see, no matter how many extra amino acids you have of the other 8, whichever is the least is going to be your rate limiting step, kind, so to speak, like the weakest link in the chain, right? And based on this, grains, nuts, and seeds, which are low in lysine, veggies and beans are low in methionine, plant proteins are called as incomplete protein. But let me give you another example. You know this exercise, jumping jack? Well, we know it is mainly for the lower body strength. What about push-ups? Well, we know it is mainly for the upper body strength. So technically, both these are incomplete exercises, right? In contrast, if you do a burpee, right? Okay, then what you can say, this is a full body exercise, a complete exercise. But isn't it common sense that any person who's doing jumping jacks and push-ups is basically doing as good as a full body exercise, right? Similarly, if you see this, grains and nuts and seeds have high methionine, while veggies and beans have high lysine content, exactly opposite. So when you combine the two sources, it gets balanced and you get what is known as a complete protein. In fact, whenever we eat, nobody eats only rice. We eat dal chawal. Nobody eats only roti. You have sabji roti. In fact, all traditionally evolved diet are evolved in such a way that there is a natural complementation of these proteins and amino acids. So we have to stop looking at individual foods. You have to look at the plate that we are consuming and whether everything is balanced. It doesn't have to be at the same time also. Even if you eat rice in the morning and dal in the evening, it will still balance out, right? The other concept is that animal proteins are high quality and plant proteins are low quality. Now, what is this based on? This is based on certain scores which have been given, amino acid score. The latest one which is accepted is the digestible indispensable amino acid score. Now, what does this mean? It is based on the absorption of the limiting amino acid. So they're looking only at the limiting amino acid, especially lysine. Now, we know that based on lysine, the grains, nuts, and seeds will have a poor score, while the vegetables and legumes get a high score because they are not deficient in lysine. You know what this reminds me of? It reminds me of this. For a fair selection, everybody has been given the same exam that please climb that tree. And what is going to happen? Obviously, some people are going to be very happy, and some, like the fish, is going to be completely out of sorts. So if we judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, we will declare it to be worthless, isn't it? Which is what we are doing. We are giving the lysine test to everybody. So obviously, some people, like the wheat, grains, nuts, and seeds, are going to be sad, while vegetables and legumes are going to be happy because they are good at lysine. But these same reports go on to say, and which is not emphasized, is that multiple protein sources can be combined to increase the score, which is nobody is taking that into account. People are looking only, oh, this has poor lysine score, forget about it. No, you can combine it with other and increase the score. It's as simple as that. which is why the dietary guidelines say that a balanced vegan diet meets the requirements of all the essential amino acids. So to meet your amino acid needs, eat enough calories, eat whole foods with high PER, and eat a variety of plant foods. So no, plant proteins are not incomplete, they complement each other. Then is meat a better source of protein? This is the big thing. Well, if you look at the RDA for individual amino acids, a chicken breast serving will give you 2 times more what you require, right? Amazing. On the other hand, combining chickpeas with white rice will just about fulfill your amino acid requirement. So definitely meat is going to give you a lot more protein. But remember again, our body cannot store extra protein. Anything extra is either excreted or stored as fat. Also, we need to look at the complete package, right? Animal foods also give us cholesterol, trans fats, and saturated fats. Now, let me look into each of this. Cholesterol, overall, there's no strong evidence that it is leading to any cardiovascular risk, but meta-analysis suggests that most analysis associate intakes of cholesterol with elevated total or LDL cholesterol. So, within limits, it is best not to exceed whatever is the current recommendation. What is very clear about trans fats is that they are a significant risk factor for cardiovascular events. Nobody will argue upon that. Many people equate trans fats to processed foods, which is very true. Most of the trans fats are coming from processed foods, but they have a natural presence in dairy and meat products also. And if you look at this trans fat study, as much as 3 to 6% in dairy and as much up to 9.5% in beef and mutton, trans fats are present. And this is the WHO article which says that naturally occurring trans fats from ruminants, meat and dairy foods are equally harmful as industrial produced trans fats. Saturated fat is the big thing, highly debated. There are people who said, wow, it's good for you. Some people say it's bad. It's a huge debate. A whole talk will not be sufficient to explain this concept itself, but I'm going to select a Cochrane study, which is considered to be the top of the top studies, which take into account only the best of the best meta-analysis and analysis that. What it said, it took 15 RCTs, and it said that animal fats replaced with plant oils or starches, there's a 17% reduction in the risk of heart disease and strokes, right? Which is why the American Heart Association advisory, what they did, they checked the risk of cardiovascular disease by replacing saturated fats with other fats and starches. So if you replace saturated fats with trans fats, there is an increase in the risk. So trans fats are worse than saturated fats. If you replace them with refined carbs, the risk is still increasing. So refined carbs are also worse. But if you replace them with complex carbs, that's whole foods, whole grains, the risk reduces. If you replace them by monounsaturated fatty acid, the risk reduces even further. And if you replace them by polyunsaturated fatty acid, the risk is significantly even less. Okay, so guidelines look at the wordings, taking into consideration the totality of the scientific evidence, satisfying rigorous criteria for causality. We conclude strongly that lowering intake of saturated fat and replacing it with unsaturated fats, especially polyunsaturated fats, will lower the incidence of cardiovascular disease. So there is no element of doubt left in this statement as far as I'm concerned. But that's not all. Animal foods have also various toxic and inflammatory products. Heme iron is associated with risk of colon cancer and increased cardiovascular disease. Heterocyclic amines are related to neurotoxicity, myocardial toxicity, diabetes, even carcinogenicity. Nitrosamines, all these are coming from animal foods, known to be carcinogenic and teratogenic. Neo5-GC coming from animal foods is known to be highly inflammatory, leading to atherosclerosis and cancer. Advanced glycation end products are also related to multiple diseases. TMAO, okay, has been shown to have increased risk of mortality. Antibiotics are all now found in animal products, okay? Not just any old stupid antibiotics. Antibiotics like colistin are used to increase their weight rapidly. Contaminants are found in plants and animals both, but there is something called as bioaccumulation where animal tissues keep accumulated toxins over time, and there's biomagnification, which means the concentration increases higher up the food chain because from all sources it is coming to you. And that is true for all animal foods. If we go and eat the source, that is the plants, there is a lesser chance of contaminants as compared to eating the higher food animals. Also, sometimes evil is merely the absence of good. There is zero fiber in animal foods, right? And there are multiple benefits of eating fiber, which are completely missing in animal foods. In fact, 95% of people in US are fiber deficient. Rather than asking this question, we should be asking, where do you get your fiber from? Because animals are just middlemen for the whole thing. We can directly get our proteins from plants, or we can pass them via animals and try to get them. This is known as biological processing. What happens in that? Of course, it adds more proteins, which is good, but it removes fiber, adds cholesterol, antibiotics, hormones, removes all other plant benefits, increases saturated fat, adds toxic compounds, changes the gut microbiome, and concentrates the contaminants, right? Is it a worthwhile bargain for those proteins? Now, a single death is a tragedy, but a million deaths becomes just a statistic. And that is what it is. 100 billion deaths that are occurring every year in the name of proteins. Is that justified? Let us look at more evidence, right? I'll quickly run through because and I'm talking of these, systematic reviews and Cochrane studies based on which these national recommendations are made. If you look at diabetes, it has been found that plant protein intake was significantly and inversely associated with type 2 diabetes. Total protein intake and animal protein intake were positively related. In younger and middle-aged women, nearly 2 times the risk with processed meats. This was independent of saturated fats and cholesterol. What about India? Higher intake of pulses and legumes shown to be protective against risk of diabetes. Right? What about overall mortality? Again, plant and animal proteins were compared. Huge 32 years study with repeated dietary assessment. High animal protein intake was positively associated with cardiovascular mortality, and plant protein intake was inversely associated with all cause and cardiovascular mortality. They did a substitution analysis, again, replacing animal sources with plant sources, all cause mortality significantly favoring plant protein, also the cardiovascular disease mortality favoring. If you look at disease itself, many studies show statistically non-significant, but low carb, high protein diet has been associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease after 15 years of follow-up. Right? Again, they did a substitution analysis. Whenever you replace carbs with plant proteins, there was a 30% reduction in cardiovascular mortality. If you replace carbs with animal proteins, no change. If you replace animal proteins with plant proteins, again a 30% reduction in mortality. When carbs are replaced with red meats, there was a 44% increase in the risk. And when carbs were replaced with dairy products, 41% of increase was found. What about cholesterol? Not a very strong evidence, but there was an inverse effect for intake of soya protein on LDL. So soya could be a little protective. Cancer, the risk is very clear. Red and processed meat was associated with several cancers, especially colorectal, and meat might increase the risk relative to vegetable protein. So it's not just any protein, it is the specific animal protein that we are talking of. Hypertension, again, inverse association with vegetable protein, but animal protein related to increased risk of hypertension. What about the elders, right? We promote proteins for elders. There was a positive association found, but with low calcium intake, an increased risk of fractures was related to high animal protein. This is interesting. Your calcium is related to your fractures here because if you take high protein. What is that? Because there's something called as adaptation. A doubling of protein intake can cause a 50% increase in urinary calcium excretion. So more protein you intake, calcium is lost from the body, which could lead to bone resorption and osteoporosis. And in the contrast, studies have shown that older Chinese men and women who have a plant-based diet may have actually half the calcium requirement. Meaning, if you're on plant-based diet, your requirement for calcium itself will reduce. If we talk of muscle mass, there's a positive relation, but in the range of 13 to 20 protein and PER itself, and no statistical significant association once adjusted for physical activity. Effect of protein supplements also was inconclusive. Most have recommended, after rigorously assessing all available data in old people, and no studies unequivocally demonstrate that protein requirement would be higher in older adults. Right? What about obesity? Again, low carb, high protein diets may result in greater weight loss, but not sustained over time, difficult to maintain, maybe less safe. Okay. Kidney disease, in disease patients, in kidney patients, very clear risk that we should not give proteins less than 1.4 grams per kg, preferably from vegetable sources. In normal adults, they have found that diets higher in plant and animal proteins are associated with benefits, particularly reduction in weight, but no apparent impairment of kidney function. This was the conclusion. But if you look at the coefficients, you can see compared to animal and plant proteins are 1.7 times better. Now, in the conclusion, they have just combined the two and said, but they're not splitting and giving the conclusion. On the other hand, if you look at the BUN concentration, with plant proteins, there was no increase, but there was a significant increase with animal as well as dairy protein. So obviously, animal and dairy protein are some way affecting the kidney. It is the plant protein which is averaging it out and not coming into the total conclusion. So all in all, number of countries recommend that populations reduce their protein intake from animal-derived foods and switch to more plant-based alternatives, a plant-predominant dietary pattern. So no, meat is not a better source of protein. In fact, it has a higher risk. Can athletes thrive on proteins? There are many athletes who believe in the power of plant-based proteins. In fact, 60% of the food served at Paris Olympics was plant-based. Many athletes won medals at the Olympics, but it's not new. Since 1900s, people have been winning medals on plant-based diet. The Roman gladiators were the strongest men at that time were found to eat wheat, barley, and beans with no sign of meat or dairy products. Many bodybuilders on plant-based diet are there. He's a world strongman who was asked, how could you get as strong as an ox without eating any meat? He said, have you ever seen an ox eating meat? Well, that is because the optimal brain fuel is glucose, okay, and which improves focus during intense training and competition. And carbs come from proteins, comes from plants. Nitrates in the plants are shown to increase blood flow and improve muscle efficiency. Animal products are pro-inflammatory. A single hamburger can increase risk inflammation in our body by 70%. Okay, who is more likely to have protein deficiency? A healthy sedentary person or a healthy active person, or it doesn't matter? Well, the answer is a healthy sedentary person is more likely to be protein deficient. Why? Because an active person spends more energy, consumes greater amounts of food, and hence has higher absolute level of protein consumption. The demand for amino acids and nitrogen increases to a much lesser extent, if at all, by doing exercise, right? In athletes and exercise in athletes, if you see, protein requirement can be met through diet alone and no need for supplements also. It is the training that explains the increase in muscle mass. Even ICMR guidelines say that there is no need to consume any protein supplement powders. In fact, they could be harmful because of the additives that are put into it. And it has been shown that it is the resistance training, okay, that is important. Maximum of 20 grams per protein per day per meal is sufficient for giving the protein muscle synthesis. 20 into 4 is 80 grams per day, is more than what you require. No further increase seen again if you take more than 0.25 grams per kg per meal, that is around 1 gram per kg per day. So protein supplements are best avoided. If you have to take plant-based proteins, minimally processed, and along with fruits, veggies, and whole grains, because otherwise the absorption will not be good. And I have done multiple things without protein supplements, but remember, muscles are built in the gym and not in the kitchen, right? Studies have shown that the protein's effect on hypertrophy is small compared to the stimulus of the exercise itself, right? Which is why there could be many people who don't have access to high protein sources still having bodies like this. So can athletes thrive on plants? Most certainly, yes. But did eating meat help us evolve? Well, if proteins helped us develop our brains, one would expect that importance to be reflected in the consumption of breast milk, right? Our mother's milk should reflect the evolution needs. In fact, human milk is low in proteins. It is the lowest amongst mammalian world. And anthropological studies have shown that our ancestors did not consume substantial meat. They had a diet very similar to modern herbivores, but different from carnivores. So consumption did not pave the way for larger brains. So not really. Finally, what does the future hold? This was a beautiful paper I shared earlier also. Current diet, if you follow, we are going to have millions of undernutrition, people, high increase in obesity, and global warming is going to go overboard. But if we change the diet, we can reverse all this and restrict the global warming as well. And what is this change? Universal increase of whole grains, fruits, vegetables, and nuts, less consumption of ultra processed foods, animal source foods consumption significantly reducing. Basically, a whole foods plant-based diet. And they recommend that the animal product intake, which is going up, has to come down. The plant intake, which is not going anywhere, has to increase significantly. Then what will happen? The global obesity rates will start coming down. Premature mortality because of lifestyle diseases will start coming down. In fact, global deaths attributed to dietary risks, 7 out of top 9 risks are because of lack of a whole food plant-based diet. And if you look at a sustainable food future, whether it is land use, freshwater use, greenhouse gas emissions, whatever, whether you consider per calorie or per gram protein, whatever you look at it, animal-based foods are dangerous as compared to plant-based foods. In fact, to get 1 kg of beef protein, we will require 30 kg of plant protein. A great man once said that there are no middlemen in my government. So similarly, there is no place for middlemen in our government. Every protein has to reach the poor. Then we cannot afford to lose so much proteins that we are consuming. So only a plant-based diet is sustainable. So to summarize, sedentary adults would require around 0.8 to 1 gram per kg per day. Older adults, why? Because they're less active, their calorie intake is less. So we have to give them higher PER foods. Endurance athletes and strength trainers who need to bulk up, who need to gain muscles, will require higher requirements. In pregnancy and lactation, of course, you have to add another 10 to 20 grams of proteins. Up to 1.6 grams per kg per day would be safe. The position of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics is very clear. Plant-based diets are nutritionally adequate, provide health benefits, appropriate for all stages of life cycle, and more environmentally sustainable. We can get all the proteins we need from a whole food plant-based diet without the damage caused by animal agriculture. So I'll leave you with a small clip here. Just look into this.
ओहो दीपिका जी आइए आइए लीजिए आपका सब सामान तैयार
ये नहीं वो
होल फूड्स प्लांट बेस्ड डाइट,
लेकिन आप तो वो हमेशा
प्रोटीन वाली,
लेती थी
वही महंगी प्रोटीन वाली क्वालिटी, वही हेल्थ, वही टेस्ट, कम डैमेज में मिले।
तो कोई ये क्यों ले वो न ले
मान गए
किसे
आपकी पार की नजर और
प्लांट बेस्ड डाइट,
दोनों को
प्लांट बेस्ड डाइट
हेल्थ का सुपर दम, डैमेज फिर भी कम।
So if there's one single message you want to take from all this, right? How much ever protein one decides to take, plant proteins are way, way better for us than animal proteins. Not only for our health, but for our environment, for the future of our children, and of course, for those that we share this planet with. We are what we eat. Let us eat the rainbow, not the morgue. Thank you so much.